This is August the 23rd, 2022. My name is Oliver Boyd-Barrett. This is a follow-up, actually, to an introductory video that I made the other day on Substack. The first video that I had done to supplement the posts that I regularly make to my Substack account in particular concerning the current conflict between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, what I call a proxy war. So my intention is to make these recordings on YouTube and then also to post those recordings to my Substack account so that my Substack subscribers can watch those in addition to digesting the other materials that I make available on that site. So my idea is maybe 2 times a week, perhaps more often, perhaps a little bit less often. It will remain to be seen, as I have many other projects and things to do. As I explained in my introductory video, which is available on Substack, actually available free on Substack, I did make some comments with respect to my own background to this issue, namely that I have, as a media scholar, I have amongst my books is one that's about the mainstream media coverage of the Ukraine crisis of of the period 2013 to approximately 2016, 2017. Therefore, some of the vital stages before the outbreak of the current stage of the conflict in February, on February the 24th, 2022, earlier this year. So I have written a book. I've also undertaken some analysis of Russian media, and in particular the Russian news agency Interfax. I have a book that is about that news agency, Interfax. I also have lectured for the Higher School of Economics. It's a Moscow-based university. As one of various places around the world at which I have had the opportunity to undertake lectures as a visiting professor, and I continue to teach regularly here in Southern California for institutions of higher education. So the general purpose of these particular videos will be to try to relate to current developments in the situation in the context of the war that's centered on Ukraine, of course, but which I also see as one of several developments spearheaded principally by the United States with its NATO allies that appear to be designed, wisely or unwisely, to trigger or to escalate what would ultimately be seen as World War III. I very much hope that that does not occur, but it's undeniable, I feel, that there are developments afoot that are heading us in that direction. And so I'm doing my best to make what sense I can, referring as much as I can to many other voices out there who are also trying to analyze, trying to make sense of this conflict, or these various conflicts that will add up ultimately to World War III. And I make reference to many of these sources in my posts on my Substack account, which I generally label critically linking NATO's war, as I have also, the title to which I've also given this video and this, what I intend to be this series of videos. So where are we now? On August the 23rd, 2022. So in terms of Western voices trying to make sense of the war, and in particular Western mainstream media, there does seem to have been, at the beginnings at least, of some kind of sea change just in the last week or two, towards a greater openness to the possibility that the war certainly is not a walkover for the West, and that the West might actually lose the war. And the continuation of the war could be very, very dangerous to Western interests. I don't say that is the dominant view by any means, but there are more voices that are looking over the precipice, so to speak, into what could happen that is rather more negative from a Western point of view than seemed to be the case back in February, 6 months ago, almost to the day, 6 months ago. So why has there been this sea change? Well, principally it is because of Russia's indisputable military advance into Ukraine. A lot of people may be disappointed that it took 6 months for Russia to get as far as it has. Some of those voices of disappointment come from Russia, understandably. Other voices of disappointment or mock disappointment come from Russia's critics in the West, who have taken comfort in regarding the pace of advance by Russia in Ukraine as some further confirmation of the Western propaganda that Russia's military capability is weak, subject to poor leadership, ill-equipped, whose soldiers are poorly trained and demotivated, and all of these other things that we were encouraged to believe, or mainstream media encouraged us to believe. Of course, mainstream media bowing to the directions or to the preferred readings of the principal Western political and military spokespersons for this war, wanting us to believe at the beginning of the war that Russia's special military operation was a caricature, a joke. The definitive account is yet to be written as to what actually was going on in those early days and weeks of the war. I myself am inclined to believe that whatever was going on, the intention was not on the part of Russia to capture, to take Kiev. I think that would have been far too preposterous an ambition on the basis of the numbers of troops and tanks that they sent into Kiev. I think I tend to give some credit to the possibility that the opening gambits were intended as a diversion, so that the Ukraine's considerable buildup of force in the Donbass, that the Ukrainian army would divert some of its troops from there towards Kiev and to other parts of the country. Fairly standard kind of diversion, I would think, militarily. I think that makes better sense than simply the simple narrative of an invasion attempt on Kiev that went wrong, and Russia withdrew and then moved all of its forces into the Donbass. Well, no matter what our understanding of the opening weeks of the war is, the reality is right now that the Russian army, in conjunction with the in conjunction with the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, in conjunction with the Wagner Group, a supposedly private army, but with very close links to Moscow, together with forces from Chechnya, and then, of course, the mainstream Russian army and armored forces. They have already secured. They've taken over the Luhansk Oblast, which is a broader area than the Luhansk People's Republic in itself. They have the Russian army has taken much of Donetsk, but there is intense fighting. There has for many weeks now been intense fighting along the Ukrainian defense lines, the most important of which is a 1,000-kilometer line from the town of Seversk to the town of Kramatorsk. There were several such defense lines that the Ukrainians had, and the commentators who I believe to be the most reliable say that it's this particular defense line that is the most important and the strongest, but it is a defense line which the Russians appear to have been increasingly breaking through at various points, and that after that defense line is down, so to speak, there will be no further comparable defense line to hold up a Russian advance, should such a thing occur, a Russian advance occur further west of the Donbass. In the event, the Russians have indicated, Moscow has indicated that in the event that there are no effective peace negotiations, and no one is confessing to anything of that kind at the moment, in the event that there are no peace negotiations, this seems quite likely that Russia would extend its territorial ambitions, and that already seems to be the case in the south. Russia had several months ago had already secured Mariupol. It already holds the port city of Kherson. The Ukrainians have been making a lot of noise for a long time now about launching a counter-offensive that would take back Kherson, but so far that counter-offensive has not occurred, and the sources I most trust indicate that it's unlikely that this much talked about counter-offensive from Ukraine will actually ever occur. But there is continuing fighting, or at least there are continuous missile strikes by Ukraine against certain locations in and around Kherson city, particularly concerning the, I think it's the Avanotsky Bridge and a dam that is close to Kherson and carry road and rail connections that have suffered some damage, but not irreparable. And I believe these transportation routes are still operable. But I also think there's some doubt as to just how important they are, given that there are pontoon bridges, and there are ferry crossings, and there are other sea routes that should enable Russia to continue to supply the people of Kherson city. So I think there's been a lot of noise about Kherson. Some of that noise may be intended to divert attention from the more significant and substantial advances that Russia has made in the Donbass. There are also, by the way, Russian advances in Kharkiv to the north. So that was a city that was first taken by Russia early on in the war, and then it was taken back by Ukraine, and now Russia seems very intent on taking back Kharkiv into its own Russian-controlled territory. Just today, it does look as though there are more significant Russian measures towards Nikolaev. I'm sorry, making a Mykolaiv, making it what the British call a pig's breakfast over the pronunciation of that term, which is it's a port city between Kherson to the east and Odessa to the left. All of these places, by the way, are just west of Crimea, which of course is in Russian hands. So the advance on Nikolaev, spelled here on my map, actually is Mykolaiv, does confirm those of us who have wondered for some time whether the ultimate Russian objective in the south is to go further west and to take Odessa, at which point then Russia would control all of the what had previously been the Ukraine's Black Sea coast. So that would be supremely significant and would give Russia far more weight in the Black Sea. So militarily, there are real and substantial advances that are being made by Russia, acquiring Ukraine territory, which I am doubtful will ever be returned to Ukraine. There's something very curious going on over the last week or so with respect to the strength and degree of commitment, Western commitment to Kiev. That has been, one might say, hysterically high since the war began in February 24th. The West called it an unprovoked war, but I think anybody who has studied the situation with an open mind will know that it was anything but unprovoked. It was a very, very much a provoked war. And Russia would have been aware, amongst other things, there are several factors to account for the nature of the provocation. But amongst other factors was the fact that there were clear signs of considerable intensification of Ukraine army fortification and build-up on its border with the People's Republics, the primarily Russian-speaking and I would say with qualifications, a broadly pro-Russian, Russian-sympathetic population of the Donbass, who had never been comfortable with the coup d'état of 2014, the US-supported coup d'état of 2014, which overthrew a democratically elected president and his government in favor of a coup regime, which achieved power to some extent on the backs of people who were protesting in the streets of the Maidan in end of 2013 to 2014, whose primary concern was the extent of corruption in Ukraine, but whose presence was greatly aggravated by and augmented by militarized and very right-wing movements, followers of the Nazi Stefan Bandera, who was active in the 1930s and 1940s. The Nazi factor is a very real one, despite Kiev's protestations to the contrary. So the buildup of Ukrainian forces over a period of 8 years, and then further intensified during 2021 and into the beginning of 2022, was a clear provocation to Russia. It signaled, first of all, to Russia that its allies in the People's Republics who had not only been subject to shelling from Ukraine for a period of approximately 8 years, but could now be subject to ruthless suppression by the Kiev-based Ukrainian army. Furthermore, the evidence of the extent of fortification of Ukrainian defense lines in that part of the world would also have signaled to Russia a growing Ukrainian capability for aggression against Russia, which Russia would have interpreted in the context of Ukraine's continuing expression of interest in becoming a member of NATO, Ukraine's active and enthusiastic participation in very aggressive NATO military exercises along the Russian border, and Ukraine's interest in and NATO's interest in the possibility of locating nuclear missile, both aggressive and defensive nuclear missile positions in Ukraine, just as it already had in neighboring Poland and also in Romania. With the consequence, therefore, that the warning time available to Russia of an aggressive nuclear attack was reduced to as little as 4 to 5 minutes. So Russia, as any other power in the world, would determine that it needed to secure greater strategic depth in order to better defend itself against nuclear attack. So these are the reasons why I argue that the Russian special military operation in February 2022, earlier this year, was not an unprovoked invasion. It was a provoked invasion inspired by the need to defend Russian security. I've talked before, and I'm sure will return many times again in the future, to the role of Volodymyr Zelensky in all of this, reminding you that Zelensky came to power in 2019 on a peace ticket. He claimed that he was going to bring about peace with Russia, which might signal to those who had been following the story that Zelensky was interested in finally returning seriously to the so-called Minsk Accords. These were international agreements signed in 2013 to 2014 between Russia, Ukraine, France, Germany, the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, as well as with in the presence of representatives of the People's Republics. These were agreements that would have required Kiev to allow much, much greater autonomy to the People's Republics. as the people's republics did not. There was never any formal indication from the people's republics that they wanted to become part of Russia in the way that Crimea had. And Russia had not indicated any interest in taking control of the republics either, or of annexing them, as it agreed to do in response to a Crimean government request for annexation with Russia following the 2014 coup d'etat, which was extremely hostile to the pro-Russian populations of the Ukraine, which included Crimea. Crimea including also hosting the city of Sevastopol, which is the center for Russia's Black Sea fleet, and which is its presence there having been approved by international treaties since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, and formalized by a lease agreement between Russia and Ukraine. So where are we now? As I've said, we have significant Russian advances into the Donbass, along the south, along the Black Sea coast. There are no indications of peace negotiations or preparations for peace negotiations. There is a mood, a growing mood, even in the West, that the West, in many ways, not only has it shot itself in the feet, but probably in the head as well, inasmuch as the economic sanctions that were introduced by the United States and NATO and the European Union following the February invasion, inasmuch as those sanctions have operated, they have operated, I would say, more to the economic disadvantage of the West, or at least of Europe, than they have of Russia. The principal reason being that the principal component of the sanctions relates to the export of Russian oil and gas. The European had, for some extraordinary reason, it assumed that Russia would just go along with this without reacting in any negative way. Europe just assumed that when it announced that it would require its members to stop all Russian oil and gas imports by January 2023, it assumed that people would do as they were expected, and including Russia, and Russia would simply stand by and wait until its major sources of revenue instantly dried up in January 2023. But of course, Russia is a little smarter than the European Union gave it credit for being, and decided it would reduce its supplies to Europe right away, thus initiating a significant crisis in energy supply for the European Union, which particularly hit Germany particularly badly. France, it hit everybody pretty badly. Germany perhaps more than most. France not quite so much because of French dependence, and this is a total other subject. I think unwise dependence, but French dependence for this particular crisis, French dependence on nuclear power has brought it some relief. Germany Russia began to reduce these supplies even before Germany had time to build up its oil and gas reserves for the winter of 2022 to 2023. So the basic effect of all of this has been a massive increase in energy prices in Europe. It's also hit the United States as well. The United States is a principal, is a major supplier of oil and gas itself, so it hasn't been hit as badly as Europe. And for the moment, as today, there has been some relief in energy prices here in the United States, quite possibly only temporary. I say that because United States has benefited for the past 10 years from the fracking, from the shale, from its exploitation of shale deposits for oil and for gas. And that has been an immensely important boon to the US economy. But the volume of the shale deposits remaining is now beginning to reduce. So yes, from a green point of view, from a point of view responding to climate change, in a way, all of this is possibly good news, but no one wants to see the good news come too soon in a way that would totally knock out whole economies. So United States will, Europe is aggrieved more than the United States from this crisis of energy. But the United States will increasingly become a part of the community of nations that is affected by this energy crisis. In Europe, the problems are compounded where, in the case of those countries which are seeking to supplement or to compensate for the loss of oil and gas by increasing their oil output or by increasing oil imports. And Russia is also a major oil exporter. And Europe has deprived itself of that recourse as well through its own sanctions policy. And in the meantime, Russia has allied more and more closely with China. It has greatly increased its supplies of gas and oil and gas to Asia, in particular India. India perhaps more than anybody else, but also China. And China will become an increasingly important consumer of Russian oil and gas in the near future, particularly as China is motivated to try and rebuild its economy after the devastation of the COVID lockdowns that have occurred over the last 2 years or so. And as it tries also to recover from the consequences as yet untallied, I think. We don't yet know what the tally is going to be in terms of damage to the Chinese economy arising from the extreme drought that it is, along with Europe, it is and has experienced over the summer months of 2022. So for Europe, for the United States, but for Europe in particular, and for many countries of the South, this is a story of reduced supply of oil and gas, of the inability of other major producers to compensate for the loss of Russian oil and gas. A whole variety of reasons for that. But the presumption earlier on that loss of Russian oil and gas could be compensated for, by example, from US exports of LNG, liquefied natural gas. Those have been confounded. The United States is not able to produce nearly enough LNG to compensate for Europe's loss of oil and gas, although the United States, for sure, has benefited from this increased demand, just as the United States has benefited generally, one might argue, from the relative impoverishment of Europe, which makes, the US presumes for the moment that Europe's increasing impoverishment will increase its dependence on the United States. But that remains to be seen. That is a big if. particularly now that we enter this stage where a Western victory in Ukraine begins to seem something less of a slam dunk. And the prospect even of a Russian victory begins to seem something more than totally improbable. So I talked about the how Russia's economic situation, it is impacted, but it's been impacted far less gravely than the countries that have tried to wage economic war against it. And while all this has been happening, as I indicated a moment ago, the alliance between Russia and China has grown ever tighter. And both those two countries are members of the BRICS alliance that originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, and China and South Africa. Well, that already accounts for somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the global population. And it looks very likely that in the near future there will be new applicants to join the BRICS. Countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Georgia, that is to say the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Those are three quite likely contenders for membership of BRICS. So while NATO waxed eloquent for a few days about Swedish and Finnish applications to join NATO, here we had this interesting indication of expansion of BRICS, which is a far more powerful alliance, potentially, I would argue, than NATO. I mean, BRICS is primarily a political, a geopolitical, and trade alliance, not so much a military one. NATO is primarily a military alliance. But once the BRICS community begin to develop a military arm, as seems to me quite likely, then that is one further way in which the Western hegemony, led by the United States, is threatened. Now, Turkey is a very, very interesting case in all of this because Turkey is a member of NATO. It's something of a black sheep in the NATO community. It was at one time thought to become would be a member of the European Union, but that hasn't come about. I mean, it's not totally impossible that it would one day proceed, but right now that is a total cul-de-sac. Turkish membership of the European Union, but it is still a member of NATO. But the problems for NATO of Turkish membership are legion. So the first instance, Swedish and Finnish access or membership of NATO is contingent. It requires the agreement of NATO's other members, and Turkey has been saying, and it looked like there was an agreement at one point. Turkey was saying, well, if Sweden and Finland agree to come down heavily on representatives of the Kurdish population or Kurdish movements in Sweden and Finland, and only if they would do that, would Turkey agree to Swedish and Finnish membership. It looked like there was an agreement, but now I hear regularly, on a regular basis, from Erdogan that Turkey is saying that Sweden and Finland are not doing enough. They're not showing enough seriousness in meeting Turkish expectations about the expulsion of Kurdish elements from Sweden and Turkey. In the meantime, another source of concern for NATO surely is the the perpetual acrimony between Turkey and Greece, which has been exacerbated in recent years by potential competition for gas and oil, probably, but gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean. The discovery of these deposits some time ago has created new alliances and new rifts across and around the Mediterranean, and bringing in those countries that have alliances with any of the Mediterranean countries. So Turkey is quite close to Libya, or at least to the official government, or the UN blessed government in Tripoli, on the one hand, and bringing that is very much in alliance with Turkey in the further exploitation of these Eastern Mediterranean deposits. I think Syria is somewhere there in the picture as well. Syria being a potential ally in this instance of Turkey and of Russia, and Israel also is implicated in this, as well as other Mediterranean countries. But Greece has a number of islands that which are close to gas and oil deposits, and Greece is sort of, if you like, reinterpreting the laws of who owns what water in the Mediterranean in its favor, in an attempt to prevent Turkey from exploiting certain deposits that it is interested in. In the meantime, it seems to me that the United States has, although trying to maintain cordial relations with both these countries, particularly in relation to the Black Sea and the relevance of the Black Sea to the conflict in Ukraine, but also the relevance of Turkey and the Syrian war. So the United States is maintaining a delicate relationship with Erdogan, but seems to be favoring Greece right now in terms of to whom it distributes most of its hegemonic goodwill. So Turkey is an interesting, very, very interesting country to watch in this whole imbroglio. There are many points at which I talked earlier about points of conflagration towards World War III, and Turkey seems to be a player in, well, the United States is a player in all of them, of course, and Turkey seems to be a more minor but much less predictable player in several of these points of conflagration. And we've just seen, actually, I learned today that there is a possibility that Turkey will seek an accord with President Assad in Syria, possibly with a view, therefore, to reducing Turkish support for the the large jihadist groups that have now been shunted into the area of northwest Syria around Idlib. And that would therefore cut the jihadist movements off from Turkish support, leaving them very vulnerable, putting them, I think, in a category of needing to seek a rapprochement with Damascus, which I think Damascus would probably concede. Assad has actually played this game far more wisely than most people give him credit for. And I think he would find a way of assimilating, given under certain conditions and with certain promises, would find a way of assimilating this significant population in the northwest of Syria, which is primarily jihadist. And then there is a relationship between Turkey and the Kurds, the Kurdish communities in Turkey, in Syria, well, in Turkey, of course, but also in Syria. The Kurds have benefited to some extent. The Kurds themselves are actually quite a very divided community, but they have benefited from positive liaison with the United States that has enabled the United States to maintain a military presence in Syria, has provided the United States access to Syrian oil and to much of the best of Syria's agricultural land. An atrocious assault, a violation of Syrian sovereignty, every bit as egregious and as objectionable as the United States proclaims to find Russia's presence in Ukraine right now. So there are significant shifts in the wind. That's the principal point I'm going to close with in this particular video. There are very significant shifts in the wind. I've mentioned before, there seems to be a diminution of Western enthusiasm for Kiev right now. It's slow, but it's definitely visible. It was visible in the size of the recent weapons aid package that the United States announced for Kiev. And when you look close up at that aid package, you realize that the quality of the weapons being provided, both the quality and the quantity of weapons being provided, is far less than on previous occasions. It's almost as though the United States is no longer, if it ever was, is no longer particularly serious about helping Ukraine to achieve military victory. Even the size of I saw just a little while before starting this video, it looks to me as though the size of the United States kind of monthly subvention to Kiev to kind of help prop it up. Even that seems to be declining in size. So the war is going on. It's continuing, but it's continuing at a lower intensity of Western support. And that seems to me to be highly significant. It's even been suggested that the main interest that the United States now has is just using the conflict as a way of observing how Russia behaves so as to learn from Western behavior, from Russian behavior, Russian tactics, strategy, weapons, and so on. Lessons that then can be applied by the West in later conflicts. There certainly seems to me to be merit in that point of view. But what is very difficult to see right now is how the West can it ever extricate itself from Ukraine? Is this going to be an eternal conflict? One very, very much hopes not, of course, but at the same time, it's very difficult to see where exactly the break towards a lasting peaceful settlement could come, since neither Ukraine nor Washington appear to be making the right noises, nor, for that matter, at one point, Russia seemed to be very open to negotiation and discussion, but not now. If anything, Russia is totally disillusioned with Western ability to deal honestly and openly and transparently on these issues. So there's a very, very serious problem of trust here. But the longer that situation continues, then the more reason Russia, because of its concern for territorial security, may be inclined to move further west. Now, the more it does that, of course, the more hostile is the population that it will seek uh, to become responsible for, and the more scope there would be for forms of guerrilla warfare, very much actually of the kind that we seem to have witnessed in recent weeks. The sabotage explosions, so-called sabotage explosions in Crimea, for example, the kind of strange business that's going on right now as Ukraine looks like it is shelling the nuclear power point in Zaporizhia that Russia now controls, um, with the potential, many people say, of a significant nuclear accident, although other people say that's not at all likely. And the killing that we saw in Moscow of the Dugin's daughter, that tragic assassination, wasn't actually meant for his daughter. It was meant for him. I'm not sure. I think in part the Western media are now playing up these kind of Ukraine or potentially Ukraine related. We don't know necessarily who is responsible for all of these incidents. But if we presume for the moment that Ukraine is behind them, or they are being perpetrated by entities that are in alliance with Kiev in some way. If we make that presumption, then I think we might conclude, well, there's not anything really new here. Those kind of incidents have been occurring all along during this war. But it's only now the Western mainstream media are beginning to play them up, possibly because of Western embarrassment about the lack of advance, the lack of capability that Ukraine has shown in launching its much long promised counter-offensive in Kherson, and Ukraine's inability to withstand Russian advances in the Donbass and in the south, and Ukrainian inability to retake any of the territory that it has recently lost to Russia. So it may be, in part, the Western mainstream media, when they engage in these particular kinds of behavior, this is merely their compliance with the agendas that are put to them by the Western intelligence agencies and the political forces that are responsible for maintaining this war. So we are seeing what we're looking at when we're looking at Western mainstream media coverage and the trends that we can discern. We're also seeing the direction of the propaganda battles and propaganda war that is being fought alongside the real war. At times, one might conclude that Ukraine has shown much more interest in the PR war than in the real war, whereas Russia just focuses on the real war. But what happens now? So that's the question on anybody's mind who's been following this, and there are any number of scenarios. But whatever the scenario is, I think it has to address a number of questions. At what point does a Russian victory in the Ukraine significantly undermine the real interests of the United States and its NATO allies? That's one thing. At what point does a Russian victory, or even a stalemate, if you will, damage or significantly dent or undermine the strength of the alliance between the European Union and the United States? So at what point does it become apparent to political leaders in Europe that their interests are no longer met significantly by sustaining this knee-jerk, I call it the poodle dog relationship to Washington. Another question is, at what point does the state of the Russian advance or the Russian win, if you will, at what point does that threaten to become untenable as a result of forms of unconventional or guerrilla warfare that will be perpetrated by the rump Ukraine along with its NATO allies? And then again, at what point in all of this does the support for the Zelensky regime simply fall apart? You remember earlier on I talked about how Zelensky came to power on a peace ticket, which he just failed to honor. He didn't significantly or seriously pursue it. Some people would say because, like his predecessor, Poroshenko, the chocolate billionaire, I call him, was Zelensky always, or did he become simply a puppet of the right-wing militia in Ukraine? Or do we understand Zelensky's behavior by his dependence on funding for his Servant of the People Party from Ukrainian oligarchs in alliance to varying degrees with the right-wing militia, the Azov battalion, and the rest of it? And then again, at what point do we just simply judge Zelensky as a neocon, a rather simplistic neocon of Washington, working for Washington interests in opening up this most valuable resource of Ukraine, its agricultural land, to the interests of big US agriculture? Very real factor, by the way, in all of the jigsaw pieces that need to be confronted in making sense of all of this. And in part, that has gone along with the relative deindustrialization of Ukraine. It's another way in which the allies of Washington in the business of maintaining US hegemony impoverish and deindustrialize themselves over time, just as the United States has industrialized itself in such a way that its future as a hegemon is now seriously in doubt as the manufacturing hubs of the world, like China, become far more potent threats in the direction of a multipolar world. So those are some of the questions I think that we need to be looking at as we look for signs of some form of settlement of this war, and whether that would be the end of it, or if the Ukraine conflict is allowed to end in some form of stalemate, will that be followed by a new war that will keep the military-industrial complex of the United States? I call it the incubus. Ray McGovern calls it the Mickey Mat, military-industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academic, and think tank complex. I just call it the incubus, but it's the incubus, this coalition of power that's taken over the United States for the past 20 years or so. At what point does the Mickey Mat, does the military-industrial complex, does the incubus begin to feel that it's losing its grip on its power over this geopolitical entity that we call the United States of America? Ukraine itself so conveniently erupted in the immediate wake of Afghanistan. Afghanistan had been a wonderful boondoggle for all kinds of corrupt and simply silly and unintelligible interests. Some more intelligible, but Afghanistan finally was taken over by the Taliban. The original excuse for the United States invasion in the fall of 2001. Actually, at that time, the Taliban would probably have been dismantled anyway by internal forces. There's good evidence to suggest that the Taliban would have dissolved of themselves, probably far more quickly and with far and far less evidence of anything remaining that actually occurred as a result of the shock and awe United States boondoggle of an invasion in 2001 on the pretext that the Taliban had given succor, the Taliban regime had given succor to Osama bin Laden. That's a whole nother story, but how interesting it is that the instant that the Afghan excuse for military expenditure, U.S. military expenditure and profits, therefore, to the U.S. defense industries, as soon as that disappears, along comes Ukraine, where Washington decides to give tens of billions of dollars, just hands it over, without even being able to keep track of the weapons that it supposedly supplies. A lot of that weaponry going into the hands of the black marketeers, corrupt Ukrainian commanders, all kinds of potential terrorist or false flag operations across Europe for future deployment. So if Ukraine goes down, what will replace it? Well, I've already talked to some extent about that at the beginning of today's talk. Taiwan would be at the top or towards the top of anyone's list, I think. But there are plenty of other, perhaps less dramatic possibilities, and maybe it's the less dramatic possibilities that the United States feels more comfortable with because they may be more controllable and more localizable, such as the Serbian Kosovo conflict. There are always potential conflicts concerning Iran on the basis of Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons. That's the biggest joke that we've come up with in the international realm in the last 2 decades. A joke perpetrated mainly by Israel and then the United States in order to prop up Israeli interests and concerns. Another topic to come back to for later. So that's it. Bearing in mind the continuing conflict in Ukraine, continuing Russian successes in Ukraine, signs of Western disillusionment with its involvement in Ukraine. And therefore, the challenge to all of us is to make sense of what happens now. What are the different scenarios? What are the more likely scenarios? What are the implications and consequences of each of those scenarios? Not a straightforward intellectual challenge. All right, I hope to talk to you again soon.